So let's welcome Dr. Meredith Chesson tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Can you all hear me? Thank you very, very much. And I'm really honored to be here to speak about Walt Rast's legacy, but also the broader legacy of this project and Jordan's heritage. I'm going to try and not go over. My hope is to talk for about 50 minutes and then leave plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. But if I'm at any point saying something that you don't understand or I'm using terminology you don't get, please just raise your hand. I can handle it. I don't mind that, okay? What I'm going to do today is actually think about Walt's and his partner Tom's legacy in terms of how they transformed how archaeologists learn about the past, because they were absolute pioneers in helping us to understand how we do archaeology, how we are scholars, and also how we understand some of the earliest cities in the world. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today and do a few parts to this. We're going to start first with their legacy in terms of archaeology and archaeological practice. Then I want to sort of give you an update because we're just about to publish a 2-volume monograph on the excavations at Numeira, where Ted Ludwig excavated, and he had the best notebooks ever. I can't tell you how important that is, but his notebooks are the best. And then I want to talk about where we're going forward, because the project that Walt and his partner Tom founded is still ongoing. It's called the Expedition to the Dead Sea Plain, and I want to give you a sense of where we're going, what we're doing now. All right. With that said, there's just a couple things I need to mention. The first one is that all of the reconstructions in this particular, I'm going to show you lots of archaeological reconstructions. They're all done by the same artist. His name is Eric Carlson, who is fabulous. So I just want to give a nice shout out to Eric, and you'll see his work, and I hope you'll really enjoy them. The second one is that at a certain point in time, because I'm going to be talking about cemeteries, I am going to be showing pictures of human skeletal remains. And if you don't like that, because some people don't like that, I totally understand if you just want to get up and walk out. That's okay by me. But some people don't feel comfortable with those types of images. All right, with further ado, I think we will start. We'll start here. Here is a wonderful picture of Walt. I'm not sure if it was 1979 or 1981. Ted, do you know when they put up that sign?
I think it was 81.
81? Okay, so this is a picture taken by Mark McConaughey, who was another person who excavated with Walt and Tom for years. And what you can see here is it sort of encapsulates a lot of their dedication to Jordanian prehistory and to archaeology. And you can see this great sign talking about Baba Dra, and I'm going to talk about Baba Dra quite a lot tonight. But it gives you a sense of the cooperative nature of their work with the Jordanians, that it wasn't just flying in and digging and then leaving again. They were very, very invested in the heritage of Jordan. There we are. Okay. Tonight, the title is about the legacy of Walt. However, I don't feel like we can talk about this project without looking at Susie, whom I never had the pleasure to meet, but also Marilyn and Tom and their daughter Helen. And so the other person in here is also Nancy Lapp. So you have this strong group of people who worked together to found the Expedition to the Dead Sea Plain in Jordan. And so when I talk about Walt, I'll pretty much always say Walt and Tom, and then you could say Marilyn and Susie and Nancy. So when I say them, I mean all of them, because in a lot of ways it was a family affair. So when you look at something like here's Walt, okay? Here's Tom Schaub, his partner, and here's Helen Schaub, his daughter, okay? They were excavating. Then you have, in another tomb area, this is Marilyn Schaub. And here is the only picture I could find of Susie in Nancy Lapp's online things, but that's the online archives. But when I talk about this project, and when I say them, it's all of them. It's not just Walt or not just Tom. So for example, in this team photo, here's another one where we've got Nancy Lapp right here. Here's Walt. Here's Marilyn Schaub. Here's Susie, and here's Tom. And there might be other family members. Helen's in there too, but I don't know if I can tell if there are any other family members or friends who are actually there. If someone knows after the lecture, please let us know, because we are archiving all of this and we like to know who's in these pictures. So because of that really group ethos and that strong community that they founded, I want to dedicate this to all of them and thinking about all of the work that they did that really changes the way we understand one of the most important transformations in human society, which was the first cities in the world. Okay? All right. Now, because I'm an archaeologist, we have to have a map so we know where you are. Yeah. We can't not have maps. It makes us, I don't know, it makes us nervous. So here's our Eastern Mediterranean right here, Eastern Mediterranean Basin. The Dead Sea Plain is right down in here. The southern Levant is the bigger area here. And the time period we're talking about is the early Bronze Age 1 through 4, which is basically about 3600 to 2000 BC. If we want to focus in a little bit more onto this map, here's that little area here in the southeast Dead Sea Plain. And here are the main sites we're talking about that I'll be mentioning. So there's Babadra, there's Numeira, and there's a little itty-bitty site called Rast in Numeira as well. Safi, Feifa, and Khirbet Khanazir. So you're going to see photos from all of these sites the whole time. But just to give you a sense about where it is on the southeast end in Jordan of the Dead Sea. Okay. Why are we always interested in the early Bronze Age? What drew Walt and Tom and the rest of the team to this area? And one of the big questions they were really interested in was this emergence of the first towns or first cities in this area of the world. Because when you build a city, when you create a city, you change everything. You might still be farming and herding, but because you're living behind walls, suddenly you have to reorganize your daily life. You've created a new way of living in the world. And that fascinated them. And the main things that we want to think about with the early Bronze Age today, when we're thinking about it, and a lot of this is based on Walt and Tom's work, is that during this time period we have increasing socioeconomic differentiation. So with the rise of cities, we get less egalitarianism, we get differences in access to resources, like food, like water, like objects that come from far away, nice housing, all of that. So in these sites at Babadra, especially at Numeira, we're seeing the first inklings of that, which is really, really fascinating. And we see it not only in the towns themselves, but we see it in the mortuary practices, because there's a general idea that if you're treated differently in life, then you're likely to be treated differently in death. It doesn't always work that way. But there often is a correlation between differential treatment during life and differential treatment in funerary practices. So we see that at these sites. The next one is that, oops, wrong button. The next one is we see a population aggregation into walled communities. So during this time period, people left their farms and they flooded into these towns. There was something really attractive about living behind a wall. And that was one of their questions. Why all of a sudden did people just want to live inside these communities? So here's the wall at Babadra here. And you can see it's a fairly large fortification wall. It had towers, and I'll show you again these reconstructions later that gives you a better sense. But for whatever reason, people wanted to live. They bought into this idea, this project, that we need to live in these towns. And that's the question is why? When they started living into these towns, they also started, in some of them, to build non-residential storage facilities. What that means is before you have these towns, everybody stored their own stuff in their own homes. But suddenly when you move into some of these towns, not all of them, but the bigger ones, we have these buildings where nobody lives, but people have to bring their stored food goods and their stored objects. And whether that's for taxes or tithing or some other system for redistribution, it starts to happen for the first time in these towns. And that is also something really fascinating when we start thinking about who manages these storage facilities, who's organizing the maintenance of them, but also the collection and then the redistribution of those things. So it's working in, again, to this idea that with urbanism becomes difference, becomes more inequality. And the last main theme is that we see an intensification of agricultural, pastoral, and orchard production. And so because when you moved everybody together, you've got to make sure everybody's fed. So they developed different types of technologies like irrigation to raise enough crops to support everybody in those towns, but also to support those redistributions when you have those, that surplus would go into these particular types of storage facilities and then get moved out again. So these are the four major sort of transformations of the early Bronze Age, and all of them were really fascinating and intriguing to Walt and Tom. And that's part of the reason why they chose this area, because they could look at all of these questions in the same few sites. So as I mentioned in the dinner beforehand, the first time I ever met Walt was in 1995. It was in Jerusalem. It was at a conference. And he gave a paper on the figurines from the Baba Dra tombs that just blew me away. I was so excited to hear it. And I introduced myself. We had, small conversation at the Albright and in other parts of Jerusalem. And then I went off and I was working on my own dissertation. And I was working on looking at funerary customs at Baba Dra, where they had been excavating. And so I would write to Walt. And these are two of the letters that I managed to dig out of the archives, where Walt says, thanks for sharing this information. I still think you're wrong. And then this one is, Dear Meredith, this is very interesting. You might be right about this, but let me tell you why you're wrong. But always in absolutely just so supportive. Haven't you thought about this? Let me tell you about this. Let me share this sorts of information with you. You might be right here, but no, I don't think so. But it was always just so gentle and so lovely. And so I started this correspondence with both Walt and Tom about ceramics and Walt about mortuary practices. And that's how I came to begin to interact with them more and more often. And here is Walt actually in 1990, and he's drafting. And one of the things I've learned about reading his letters and reading his reports is that he was an amazing draftsperson. He did a lot of drawing for plans and for profile drawings. He did sketch maps, and I'll show you a couple sketch maps in a minute. But he was an extraordinarily gifted archaeologist, both in terms of drafting and drawing, but also in terms of excavating and keeping notes. And that is the bread and butter for us. If you don't keep a good notebook, it's like you're looting. If you can't actually record what's happening, because as we excavate, we destroy, you might as well not start. That's why I said Ted's notebooks are the best, because notebooks are what we rely on at this point. So here are actually two of these sketch maps from 1976 that Walt drew, going back to Baba Dra and thinking about, all right, we've had one full season at Baba Dra in 1975. What are we going to do next? And he's talking about all these different areas and thinking about what's really interesting and moving forward. Now, I put these out here because in the notes on all of these pages, because there are several of these maps, he's actually talking about anthropological questions. How can we find out where people are living? Can we find out if there was some sort of temple or ritual space? What's happening with these fortification walls? How are they building them? Why are they building them? These types of questions indicate a real turn in archaeological practice in Jordan. Before this time, it was really focused on let's find us some biblical sites, right? Let's prove the Bible is true by using archaeology. And even in the 1960s, when they were first being trained, those were still some of the primary questions. But what's clear is that when they started their own project in the 70s, he and Tom took a whole new shift. And this shift was, in archaeology, is called the New Archaeology, or it's also called processualism. Those are the two terms for it. But basically, it's a change in the types of questions that archaeologists ask. And what they really want to know, instead of where can we find this temple that I see in the Bible, is how do they practice their religion? Or how did they bury their dead? Not because we want to find a famous person's tomb, but because they want to understand how they buried their dead and what that meant for the society. So in these notes we have from Walt from 1976 and the earlier ones in 74, they're asking anthropological questions about why and how, not just about let's find this. And that shift was fundamental in changing the way archaeology was conducted in Jordan and in the rest of that particular region. Walt and Tom were absolute pioneers of anthropological approaches to archaeology and really changed the conversation. Not only did they change the way, the types of questions they asked, but they also put together these comparative focuses. They wanted to look at all sorts of sites in an area. Walt, in fact, was really, from the notes I can see, that he was really, really interested in how the environment affected people's communities. And we can think about where we are today with climate change and everything else, and how we are increasingly thinking about our impact on the environment and the environment's impact on us. These were questions they were asking in the 70s. They wanted to understand the emergence of these cities in an environmental and climatic context, which was extraordinary. It's really, really, really trailblazing. They also were adopting some of the more systematic survey techniques, and in building their multidisciplinary teams. Instead of just going into the field with lots and lots of students, which they did, they also had specialists along. They had a person who specialized in geology. They had a person who specialized in palynology and pollen. They had somebody come along who specialized in foodways, in particular in plants and the relationship between humans and plants. A lot of digs can't even bring all those people together today for a lot of different reasons. So here they were in 1975, just changing the whole face of archaeology. And with these particular questions they were asking, they were, again, moving away from sort of the biblical archaeology that was really typical. They were digging at the cities of the plain. Technically, they were digging at biblical sites. Babadra and Numeira are associated with the folklore around Sodom and Gomorrah. Even today, there is a lot of talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, especially if you watch the History Channel or Discovery Channel. We've spent a lot of time, actually, Walt, Tom, and I, over the years, working with different TV producers to talk about these particular sites. But Walt wrote one of the best definitive pieces on Sodom and Gomorrah, and talking about what's the relationship of the Bible to archaeological sites like these. And the idea that, yes, these sites might be identified because they're ruins and they've been around for a really long time, but the point is not to say this is definitely Sodom or this is definitely Gomorrah. That it's not about finding King Herod's grave. It's about understanding these ideas about fundamental transitions and transformations of human society. So down here, down here in this little thing here, this is taken from a note, a letter to one of the people who excavated the site, who after one season decided to give a big lecture on the cities of the plain. Ted knows this person, but I'm not going to tell you who it is. And how he was going to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. And Walt was cranked, did not like that. So he writes this letter, and it's 4 pages, single spaced, typed out, the whole works, and there are no errors. So he probably typed it 2 or 3 times just to get it really done. But he says, in short, we have one major goal at this point: the processing, assembling, and study of our materials with the goal of the earliest possible publication of our numerous results. He's talking about how some of the most promising archaeological material from this period in Palestine. And so he is talking about the archaeology and about the anthropology and not about identifying particular sites. Again, this is another transformative shift or pivot in archaeological practice in that part of the world. Okay. So given this and thinking about the types of questions they were really interested in, one of the reasons why I got so involved in this project is because they excavated so many houses, especially at the site of Numeira, but also that they were asking these questions about everyday life and everyday death and how you dealt with these fundamental parts of all of our lives. And in bringing together these multidisciplinary teams, they were able to move from the excavation of a household with these walls, and this is a nice storage silo, and this is a storage bins here, and a mortar and pestle. And then how do you actually move to something like this nice reconstruction of this particular room that shows people grinding grains, storing things in silos. This room, in fact, was filled with burnt textiles and textile tools. And so we have a lot of information about weaving and craft production as well. And because they were able to collect all this information as systematically as you could, especially for the 70s, a lot of the methodology has changed, and it's a lot more exact now. But they still gave us the tools today to learn a tremendous amount about these early towns, which was really their whole goal. So what I want to do now is actually give you a little bit of a report of Numeira and tell you what we're about to be published and some of the highlights. And if I get anything wrong, Ted, you can tell me, if there anything, because there's stuff that he excavated and then wrote about. I'm going to show you some things. But here's the site of Numeira. Numeira is about 13 kilometers south of Babadra. Babadra has a very long occupation from about 3600 to 2000. Numeira is only 300 years old, and nobody lived there afterwards. So it's a dream of a site for archaeologists because we don't have any what we would call overburden for later periods. And it has amazing preservation, just extraordinary preservation. So the site itself was probably about 1 hectare. That's about 2.5 acres. And here it is from the air. Half of the site, this part right here, is actually up in this area here. It's been cut away by the river basin, by the Wadi Basin here. But here you can see the main site that's still in existence. This middle part here is right here, and that's where they opened a very large area of houses. This part over here on the east end is actually, this is flipped because they're looking from the north, is right here with a big tower, but underneath that tower were actually more houses. And the west end here is just a gate area with a few little bits and hints of houses, but not very much. So the stuff I want to show you, to me, is the most exciting. It's right here in the center, because it gives us amazing information about their daily lives. Here's what one of these rooms look like. I'll show you, in fact. The room I'm going to show you is right here. I don't think Ted dug that one, room 11. No. So right here in room 11. And what you can see are 4 walls surrounding a whole bunch of features. There's a nice floor here. There's a storage pit in here. There's a big clay basin here that it was like a big mixing bowl probably, something that you were just using for food preparation. Over here was a bin, a clay bin, and I'll show you, this is part of it right here, that was filled with probably 10,000 burnt emmer wheat seeds, but also 1,000 burnt barley seeds. So whoever was using this hadn't cleared out the barley entirely before they dumped a whole bunch of emmer wheat in there. Just behind this wall, we also found a pot full of these are chickpeas. Okay, so we have lots of different, especially paleo-ethnobotanical samples seed samples that tell us all about not just what they're eating, but it also tells us about what types of plants they're using in crafts. We have a lot of flax, so they're making flax oil, but they're also making linen. So they're weaving linen. They have lots of cereals like wheats and grains for oatmeal and bread, because we have bread ovens and things like that we've excavated. And they also at Numeira have an extraordinary amount of grapes and raisins. And in fact, in one of the rooms, we found 3 jars that were probably full of wine. So we have some of the earliest evidence for wine in this area, which is, everybody likes to have the earliest or the best or whatever. But to my mind, what that tells me is when you have wine, you have vintners, you have people growing grapes. And grapes take a long time to mature and actually produce fruit. Then you have to feed the soil constantly. So you're going to have a lot of investment into a particular tract of land. That means you've probably got a change in ownership. We don't have that before. So it's not just that they're making wine, it's that they've got more fixed access to resources, because you need the land, you need the good soil, you need the grapes, and you need water. All of these things are working into complicating this human society, these communities, with urbanism, which to me is really, really exciting. So we have these wonderful early plant remains. So I'll take you to tour. These are the immer wheat that was in this bin here. These are barley, which were also in the bin. Here are a small detailed photo from about 1,000 carbonized raisins sitting on a floor, just in room 3. Really so exciting, just really exciting. I know I'm a geek, but it's really exciting. Here is also really cool. This looks like a big blob, right? But what this is it is a grape pip that's been burned, and it is covered with smashed grape skins, which means they had been crushing grapes. And then they threw it into a fire, and a lot of times they're also associated, we find these with a lot of goat poo, a lot of goat dung, which means they're probably crushing grapes and then feeding their goats those grapes, and then they come out the other end and they end up in trash pits. So it's this great system that combines the agriculture with the animals. They're raising goats and sheep and cattle and pigs, and it really gives you a sense of what daily life was like. Oh, and the last thing here, these are chickpeas. And what's really cool about the chickpeas is we only have 2 concentrations of chickpeas in this site, whereas we have fabulous plant remains everywhere. Only 2 concentrations of chickpeas, both in jars. And we don't have any indication that they could actually grow chickpeas there. So those chickpeas they're probably trading for, probably from up the valley. So that's adding another little complication or wrinkle to this notion of economy and how they're making their living. So again, we have this, Numeira provides us with this really wonderful evidence for olive oil production, wine, grape juice, bread making, oatmeal, groats, irrigation. We have really great evidence that they are absolutely irrigating these plants, which again is more complicated because who manages the irrigation system, who maintains it, who decides who gets the easiest water sources to that. It's all getting much more complicated than if you were living in a little itty-bitty village like they were before. So we look at a plan. I know this is going to look really complicated, okay? But the things you should take away here are that we have 3 households. One is blue, which is right here. One is green, which is right here. And one is pink, which is right here. And what we see in these 3 households are some of the same types of activities, like grain storage. Everybody's got grain. Who cares? Everybody's growing their cereals and eating their oatmeal and making their bread. But beyond that, they're starting to specialize. So those grapes that I showed you are right here. The chickpeas are in that pot right here, and this is a big pile of barley. We don't have big piles of grapes anywhere else in these other households. But in this household, this nice little purple patch here, those are those 3 bottles of wine. So we're starting to see household differentiation. It doesn't mean that they're not equal, it's just difference. But maybe, let's say, these folks here were the people that grew the grapes, but these folks here were the people that knew how to make the wine. So we're exchanging across these different households. And again, not many other sites from this time period. Numeira is probably the best site for this time period, with a big open expanse where we could compare between houses and get a sense, because of the great preservation, of these details of daily life. Most other sites, they don't do that. Most of the time they were really focused on, let's dig the temples, let's dig the fortification areas, and let's look for the rich people. And this is not what they were doing. They were not about the rich folks. They were about the everyday life of everyday people. So when we think about everyday life, and we have this beautiful reconstruction of Numeira by Erik Karlsson, we can see that people are probably doing a lot of different things. We know they're making pottery on site. We know they're making textiles on site. But probably they're not. They're probably doing a lot of that in all those houses. But there are those places that seem to be more specialized in textile production. We have rooms that are just full of textiles and textile tools. While it's across the street, that's where we've got those grapes, and we've got those chickpeas coming from somewhere else. So we get a sense of this difference, at the same time we get a sense of the similarities. So what I want to do now is take you 13 kilometers north to Baba Dra and think a little bit about how Baba Dra compares to Numeira. If Numeira was at most 2.5 acres, Baba Dra was at most 10 acres. It was about 4 hectares. To give you a sense of other early Bronze Age walled towns or cities, these are babies. These are small. So the largest sites we have are 25 hectares. But most big walled sites are like 10 to 15 hectares, maybe as small as 8, but mostly like 10 to 15. So whatever's happened on the Dead Sea Plain is sort of, they're just doing it really small. And what that tells us is that it's really, there's a lot of diversity with these emergence of these towns, that these towns are being built up on local histories and local resources, and it's on the Dead Sea Plain. There are good places to grow things, but it has a really high salt content in the soil. So you have to grow certain types of things, and you won't be able to grow other ones. So they are building this, they're all in with this endeavor to live in these cities, to live in these walled towns, but they're doing it at a smaller scale than most other places. So their trajectory is a little bit different. It's not one size fits all. But if we move north to Baba Dra, this is a view of Baba Dra opposite from here. So the helicopter's right about here, looking this way at the walled town and looking south. And what we have at Baba Dra, again, is one of these unique situations where we have a very large cemetery associated with the walled town. In most of these other early Bronze Age sites, we have small cemeteries, or like little itty bitty, one tomb here, one tomb there. Baba Dra and Jericho, also known as Tel el-Sultan, are the only 2 major walled cities that we have that also have these big, pretty well excavated cemeteries attached to them. That is what drew me, is that we could compare people's living lives and their deaths. And that was really unique. So when we think about Baba Dra, and this is another reconstruction, one of the first things you notice here is that reconstruction I showed you of Numeira is nice and flat. Everybody was up on the flat hill. But Baba Dra is in the Badlands. It's kind of a mess. And so there's constantly erosion. So these folks engineered terraced housings in the middle of the city. And that in itself is also very, very interesting to think about who organized that terracing, who decided that, yeah, we're gonna build here, but we need to make sure that everybody can get all the resources they need. And you think about sanitation, where are they throwing their trash? You think about pathways to get out of these big terraces, because these are 45-degree slopes. This is no fooling. This is serious hills. The other funny thing is that they're different. Some of the plants are the same, but some of the plants are different here in terms of foodways. Yes?
Where are the walls?
The walls, so you can see in this one, the walls are back here. Here's the main gate here, and they were excavating through here, and they found nothing. So they thought, well, maybe there's a market area here. And there's a long history in the ancient Near East of when you walk in a gate, there's actually an open plaza for a market area or a gathering area. And that's what they thought was happening. They didn't find many houses in Babadra simply because the slopes were so steep, but also they had a lot more spaces they had to look at because they opened 20 excavation areas in Babadra, I think. It was a tremendous amount of work. So we've only got a few little pieces. In this case, this area here is the one that they excavated. So we have these 2 little rows here excavated in this town. And then this big open space, which must have been really boring to dig, because there's nothing like digging a big empty nothing. You know, especially if you got all these students who are going there, they must have been bored out of their minds, right? And it was hot. It was really hot. So as I mentioned before, one of the great things about Babadra is you have this town and then you have a cemetery. And what's really cool at Babadra is every time the settlement, the type of occupation changed, the mortuary practices changed. It's almost too perfect, but we're going to go with it because it really works. So the earliest tombs we have at about 3600 are over here. They're shaft tombs. And what that means is they dug a shaft, and then off of the shaft they dug chambers, and then buried their dead, and here's what one of these tombs looks like, inside these chambers. And I'll show you more pictures to show you how that works, because there's a lot of rules to it. At this time, we have no settlement at the site. We have some campsites, and at the campsites, there are actually sort of ideas that they were probably throwing a party at some time because they have lots of faunal remains. So it's likely they might have had a little party when they were burying their dead. Pretty soon after that, after a few hundred years, somebody decided it'd be good to build a village there. Not a town, but a village. So they settle into this village at about 3100, 3000 BC. I'm a little iffy on the dates because the radiocarbon dates from the C14 dates from Babadra are a mess. There's something something's going wrong with the soil chemistry or something. We can't figure out what it is, but they are, I'm not going to say useless, but I would say infuriating. How about that? And so we're actually getting more good luck now with dating teeth. And so, but we still haven't dated any teeth from these very early graves. So that's why I'm a little bit iffy on the dates. But what's interesting here is that as soon as they settled this village, they still use these tombs, or they set up charnel houses. And this is only like 150 years. So if you think of a generation as 30 years, it's not that many generations that they're doing this. By the time they get to the walled town, full-on walled town, no more of these shaft tombs. They're all about these rectangular charnel houses in which they are burying lots and lots of people. And I'll show you another slide in a second to give you that sense. Then at the end, this walled town collapsed in about 2500, just like almost every other town in this part of the region. People voted with their feet. They left. They abandoned these cities all throughout the whole region. Took about a gap of about 200 years, and then they decided, no, we want to move back to Babadra, so they made another village. And once again, they changed their mortuary practices. So these changes in mortuary practices are really fascinating because, again, they give us a sense about the type of society people lived in. With these early shaft tombs, and here's a shaft tomb, this is A114 North, and here's a diagram of it. What you'll notice, though, are there all these skulls lined up here, and there are a big pile of bones, of postcranial, everything below the skull here, and then there are grave gifts here. And you can see that up here, including a big wooden staff and wooden bowls. Again, the preservation is extraordinary. These are all secondary burials, which means they were defleshed somewhere else. So we have no idea where these people came from because nobody settled down here. We have no settlement down here at all. They died somewhere else. The bioarchaeologists tell us that they were buried somewhere else, and then at a certain point in time, they bundled everything up, even down to your hyoid bone and your ear bones. They bundled everybody up, and they brought them down and buried them in these shaft tombs. And we're talking neonates, we're talking stillborns, 1-year-olds, 80-year-olds, everybody, and all their bones were gathered up very carefully and brought down and then placed into these shaft tombs with, if you opened up the door, Tom once said, it was really striking. You'd open up a door, you'd pull the plug off the chamber, and all these people would be lined up facing at you. Like all the skulls were facing the entrance. So you'd have all these skulls facing the entrance here, all of the other bones were in the middle, and then you have grave goods sort of scattered around. Each of these shaft tombs has anywhere from 1 to 5 shafts, and generally in each shaft tomb you'd have somewhere from 1 to 10 people, so in each chamber. So what that means is you basically have for each tomb anywhere from 25 to 50, maybe a little bit more or a little bit less. There was work done by an archaeologist who is now, she's seen the light and she's a biological anthropologist now. Her name is Gillian Bentley. And Gillian, for her dissertation, studied the teeth of the people in these shaft tombs because our teeth are really heritable. Our teeth look like our parents' teeth look like their parents' teeth. There's a real strong indication of heritability with our teeth. And so she was looking, especially at our molars. So if you have bad teeth now, your kids probably will have bad teeth, and it's a very heritable sort of thing. But she was able to track genetic relationships between people inside those shaft tombs, that people in those shaft tombs were more likely to be genetically related by blood than between shaft tombs. So obviously for these people, before they lived in these cities, kinship was very closely defined. All right? It was because you were living in smaller communities. So kinship was a smaller group of people who you would say is, oh, they're my kin. When we actually moved to the charnel houses, now this is the big dog of all the charnel houses. This is 121 meters squared. It's a big beast. And some of them were as small as 13 meters squared. But if we're looking at the teeth now in the charnel houses, but we don't have great teeth to work on them. So we're not able to prove that kinship notion still works. But what's interesting is that these charnel houses were built to size. So they built the biggest one and they built the smallest one. And inside them you have hundreds to thousands of people. And so we think that there's this idea that their notion of kinship enlarged when they moved into a larger community. Suddenly you had a lot more kin, people that you thought of were kin because you're in a lot larger community. What's also interesting, and this was something that Walt did not agree with me on, but I'm going to tell you anyway, is that I think personally that when I look at the remains inside the charnel houses in terms of number of people and the types of objects, the bigger charnel houses, I argue, have more non-local stuff. The bigger ones are where you get the gold, the ostrich egg, the faience, the lapis, carnelian, all this stuff coming from really far away. Whereas the smaller charnel houses don't have those things. And so there's a sense that maybe if you were in a small kin group, you might not have had those trade connections. You might not have been able to pull those resources from so far away that were kind of hard to get, because we only really get them in the tombs. You get them a little bit in the settlements, because there's a lot of settlements been excavated. But for the most part, this is where you find those amazing, really hard to get types of materials. So personally, again, Walt didn't believe this. Tom was like, yeah, all right, whatever. I can't care less. I'm not going to argue with you. But there was a notion that with these urban societies, that the whole notion of kinship changed. And that makes sense if their whole notion of land ownership and water rights changed. Everything is changing with the advent, with the emergence of these cities. And we can say these types of things because of the expedition to the Dead Sea Plain excavated these sites so well. And we're working on publishing the cemeteries, but we're getting there. So when we think about, here's a reconstruction of Baba Dra, here's that terraced housing there, there's that gate with the open plaza. Up here was a ritual compound, which was really cool. I'm not going to show you that, but it was really cool. And over here, also we've got another tower system. And throughout here, there are houses and bits and pieces of houses throughout. What you don't see here, which is really cool, which people tend to forget about, is they were actually living outside the walls too. That was another difference, that Walt and Tom dug outside the walls, not just inside the walls. So there's this idea that you have these walls and nobody lives outside them. But in fact, at Baba Dra, that is not the case. We have housing outside and inside, which again changes the way we understand what these towns are like. Okay. So I want to finish real briefly talking about what we're doing now, where we're going with all of this data, because we do have a lot of data. And where we're really focusing on are the cemeteries. Here's Khirbet Khanazir, here's Feifa, and here's Baba Dra, where we have all these lovely pots coming from. And we are working hard to actually collect all the information that we have from these excavations. If Baba Dra has hundreds, well, it has thousands of tombs, and I'll show you some pictures because most of them have been looted out. So now we can actually see them wrecked on the ground. It's very difficult to try and extrapolate from the few number of tombs we have to such a large cemetery, but that's one of our challenges. That's what we're going to be doing. So we're going to be looking at these. For example, the charnel houses that they excavated, and here's the big dog again, as well as the shaft tombs. The bioarchaeological, the analysis of this material here has been completed from the Smithsonian scholars Don Ortner and Bruno Froelich, but now we're working on the charnel house bioarch materials, and that's actually at Notre Dame with a professor named Sue Sheridan. She's leading up that. It is an extraordinarily difficult process because those charnel houses were just all collapsed in and they burnt. The bones are in very bad shape. So it's taking her years and years. But in fact, she is moving forward and we're starting to get some publications out there. So that's one of our main things that we're working on, are looking at the cemeteries and trying to work towards publication and analysis. The way that we're doing that is we are excavating the archives. So when Tom Schaub passed away in 2015, in late 2015, I and my colleague Morag, who's now the co-director of the EDSP with me, we drove to Pittsburgh and we packed up Tom's office. And we have been excavating his archives ever since. We have a great grant from the Wintergreen Anthropological Foundation that allows me to pay students. So I have great students who spend hours looking at really weird photographs, trying to figure out what they are, and also tracking all the letters, because we've also got a lot of correspondence that we have been logging, because our goal is that all of this material will go to the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh, which is where a lot of the materials are. A lot of the material culture is at Pittsburgh, and we're going to have an online database, and people will be able to search out letters and materials so they can actually study the history of these pioneers, but also have access to the materials themselves. So we've been looking at lots of letters. Here's a nice aerogram. You guys remember aerograms, the ancient days, right? So here's a nice aerogram from Jordan, from Walt to Tom. And we're finding fabulous photographs. This is actually Paul Lapp here with an ancient piece of technology called an alidade. That's how people like me learn to draw, with an alidade, not with an EDM electronic measuring thing. And we're finding all sorts of great letters from the Jordanians and archives, but we are swimming in archives. There's so many, it's hard to explain, but it's really fascinating. One of the things this is Tom right here actually, in 2004 when we were working at Numeira, and what you're looking at is we're actually at Baba Dra in 2004. And these holes, each of these holes is a looter tomb, is a looted tomb. And so looters have hit these sites because the materials you get out of them are very desired on the antiquities market, the illegal antiquities market. So we're talking to Tom about what are we going to do with this, Tom? We're going to have to publish these cemeteries, but they're just full of holes. How much information have we lost? With all this looting, we're losing data, but we're also losing a real certainty that the types of conclusions we come to are right because we've lost so much. And so that's something we had long talks about. And what we came down to is the fact that we have a bit of a crisis. We have your typical archaeological story. The typical story is you dig and you have a really good time, and then you spend entirely too long writing up because it takes forever, and then you publish. And it's this nice, beautiful story. It's this archaeological story. We don't have that happily ever after. We don't have that with these particular cemeteries, because when they were excavating these this is at Feifa. Here's a nice little shaft, a nice little cis tomb, so a stone-lined tomb here. These are the types of goods you find in these tombs, nice pots. Actually, they're kind of ugly pots. They're like the pots only I can love, or Morag can love. But they're these nice little pots, and some carnelian beads, and some alabaster mace heads, and these are Red Sea bangles. They're shells, bracelets. And you think, oh, well, this is great. We're just going to publish this. And so this is what one of these tombs, here's a reconstruction of what one of these tombs might look like. Again, we have disarticulated secondary burials. But when they were first there in 1990, that's what it looked like. In 1998, here's an aerial photograph, and each of these little dots is a looter's hole. In 2001, when we went to visit, that's what it looked like, as far as the eye can see. In 2011, we actually surveyed Feifa to try and track and understand how much we're losing. So we did a really intensive survey of Feifa, trying to understand what we're losing about this. And this is part of a new project that the EDSP is leading, and this is my colleague Morag, who couldn't be here tonight. She teaches at DePaul, but she had a DePaul function she couldn't get out of. But this is Follow the Pots. And Morag is in charge of following the pots. I'm in charge of following the archives. She's following the pots. She has, in many ways, a better job because she flies all over the world finding looted stuff in markets. She's got a great job. But here she is in Jordan, and what we've been using are drone technology to actually take every year or every 6 months, depending upon our funding, snapshots of these cemeteries, Babadrof and Feifa right now, because we want to see how much looting happens per year. We want to be able to track it. So here's one of our drones right here with Morag. And here's one of the shots. This is Feifa. And what you see at Feifa is a really sweet site. It has a nice little Iron Age walled thing. I don't know what that is, but it's an Iron Age thing. So for the Iron Age people, there you go. But it is a cemetery that's about 6 hectares, so whatever 6 times 2.5 is, that's how many acres it is. And you can just see it is covered with holes. It is absolutely covered with holes. And in fact, when we have our GIS guy go and analyze these aerial photographs, all of these green things, basically the whole place is one big hole. The red ones are the test excavations that Walt and Tom conducted in 1990. So you can see how many holes there are, and this is the amount of data we have. That's it. The other problem here, of course, is that where excavators go, looters follow. So in a lot of ways, it's our fault that this cemetery is looted out, because we showed them the way. We showed them what was going on. In terms of the mortuary, what we call, in anthropology, called a mortuary toolkit, in terms of the types of grave goods you get, there are these lovely stone bowls here, mace heads. Occasionally we get a little bit of metal, lovely pots. You already saw these guys and these guys. So we have these basic tools that we know from excavations. So we wanted to find out what the looters left, because one of the things that we're trying to do is understand why people loot, and why people, and what they want and what they don't want. So we did this intensive survey to try and see what's left behind. All right, and here's an archaeologist, this is Isabel Rubin, who's here, taking some information on one of the looted tombs. And we went and counted every piece of material culture around each of these looters' holes, and then mapped them out. These are 20 by 20 meter units, and we did 10 of those. So we did about 200 square meters of just mapping intensively what's left around these particular tombs. And what we see is they really don't care about this lovely fan scraper that some people get really excited about, like my husband who does chipstone tools, he loves that. They don't do shell bangles. They don't really care about mace heads either. They are after the pots. They're totally after the pots. And if the pots are broken, they just toss them on the side. So they want whole pots. And in some cases, they really want them decorated. So what we find in Follow the Pots is that they're actually first and second lives, and probably third and fourth lives of all of these pots, of all these objects, that they become their first life is as a grave good. Their second life is when people like us dig them up. Another pathway on a second life is when the looters get it. Their third life is when they hit the market and they are taken home for some sort of memento or tourist good. So where they end up a lot of times is on eBay. Here's one on eBay. This is in a licensed antiquity shop in Israel. So they're moving around. And I'm going to show you that one first. Where they're moving is they leave Jordan and then they go everywhere. They've been sold. In the 90s, what's that store called? Debenhams in London? Debenhams? Yeah. They had a huge display of these pots for sale for Christmas. Have a pot from the Holy Land. Absolutely illegal. We have no idea where Debenhams got it. But they were even advertising it in the newspaper because we have the advertisements. It's crazy. So they're going all over the world. So we find them all over the world. And that's Morag's job. She's marking them. But also, one of the ways, especially in the 1970s, that the EDSP raised money for the project was they sold pots from earlier excavations in the 60s. It was legal. Why not? They're pretty, And so Morag has documented every single institution that now has pots from these excavations. And they're all over the place. And generally, only one institution sent them back because they said they were ugly and they felt ripped off. That was Berkeley. So Berkeley sent them back and it's a great letter. We feel robbed. I can't imagine anybody else likes these pots. Very, very uppity. So we've got each of these dots is where we found pots. From the Vatican, they're just everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. So that's the legal institutional pathway, and then you have the hidden ones, the illegal ones, and these are for tourists. When you talk about diplomatic pouches, when diplomats travel with they don't have a pouch, they have a container that goes on a ship, right? And that's where a lot of these materials are moving through, okay? As well as your everyday middleman who are buying these pots from people. What we've discovered, at least down in the Dead Sea, that people loot for a lot of different reasons. And they loot economically because they need to feed their children. They also take their kids along on these as kind of like a fun outing on the day. And actually in Sicily, it's the same way. There's been a big study of looting in Sicily, and it's like, hey, let's go crack open a tomb and have lunch. Bring some wine, bring some espresso, some snacks, and you go out into the countryside and you rob out a tomb. And so people are also doing that. They're also doing it in protest to stick it to the man. They're angry because their life is tough. Economically, they are really, really stressed. So there's not just one reason why people loot, and sometimes kids loot because they see their parents looting. So it's kind of what they do. So it's not easy. It's not an easy it's not an easy fix. And that's one thing that we learn. And one of the reasons why we can learn this is because Morag and I take a slightly controversial stand in archaeology by saying we will talk to looters. A lot of archaeology, especially the Society for American Archaeology, refuse to deal with any looting. They don't want to talk to looters. They don't want to sanction what they're done. And so we've decided we're not going to play the bad guy. We're not going to judge them. We're going to try and understand why they're looting, so maybe we can try and stop it or offer them alternatives in some way without sort of being really paternalistic and coming in and saying, we know better than you. We're going to tell you why you shouldn't loot. But actually try and set up systems where it's community driven, that they find a way for themselves to really enjoy this archaeological heritage. And that's one of the things we're trying to do with Follow the Pots. Okay. So that's where we're going. What I want to do is I want to close actually with a letter, and I'm going to cry, so just deal with it. This is a letter written in May 2003 from Tom to Walt, when it was pretty much one of the last times they'd really be able to talk to each other, I feel like, or really. Tom just says he needs to talk to Walt. So May 7th. The latest report on the progress of your cancer impels me to try to organize some of the many thoughts I've written down over the past year about our work together, and especially about the many roles you've played in my life. The most visible output that has linked our names together for posterity is in the collegial cooperation efforts of the fieldwork and publications of the EDSP. Some have marveled at the endurance and closeness of our relationship in the EDSP, but I do not think even they can truly appreciate the levels of mutuality and interdependence that our work on the project has engendered. As I read through my copies of your emails since 2000, parentheses, I have only yours, not mine to you, even I am impressed at the mutual respect and support we offered to one another as we wrestled with the many challenges of bringing together and interpreting the work of so many years and so many people. Through the years, we have produced some excellent publications, but this volume on the town site, that's the one published right before Walt died in 2003, surpasses them all and will be a lasting witness to our cooperative efforts. Less visible to others are the roles you have played in my life. Throughout our long relationship, you have been a teacher by example and a faithful guide and counselor through your ever thoughtful comments and responses to me. During the dig seasons, you have always offered quiet leadership, taking on menial tasks to give example to others. Your unfailing optimism was always a great antidote to my tendency to see and exaggerate problems. Most of all through the years, your incredible patience, especially with my procrastination habits and writing handicaps, helped our relationship through its rare, rough stretches. As I recall the early years of our field seasons, I am sure I was overly aggressive and overreaching considering my lack of actual field experience. But your patience helped our relationship to survive and encouraged the mutual respect for one another's contributions that made the project work. I believe that over the years we developed levels of exchange that were mutually supportive and involved true dialogues on differences. Surpassing the achievements and levels of cooperation, however, is the abiding sense of friendship. Acceptance, deep appreciation, mutual respect for one another have provided the solid basis for friendship. The many great experiences we have shared over the years provide the lasting memories that give a glow to that friendship. Above all, then, my dear Walt, I am deeply grateful for your friendship through the years. Love you, Tom. So thank you all very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah?
You never mentioned why people built the walls. Was it because of warfare? Did the neighboring towns fight among themselves, or?
So that's the big question nobody can answer, because we don't have a lot of evidence for warfare. But maybe there's evidence for threat. There are very few sites that actually have warfare or destruction that show that somebody's attacking another site. Like, there are hundreds of early Bronze Age walled towns, but I can think of 2 reports that have really absolute, smoking gun, if you will, evidence for that.
Those walls you showed were dramatically long and wide and took a huge amount of effort to build.
Exactly.
People don't do that unless they want to keep something out or keep something in.
Right, and it's probably both. And what's also interesting is at most sites, those walls are built in like 7 to 10 meter segments. So you can imagine maybe family groups coming together and saying, oh, we got to do our job. That's our segment over there. Let's go, let's do it. So they're all really interesting. But nobody knows. Everybody argues about it. Yeah.
The other thing you mentioned, which I had told, I think I heard you right. You said that they threw the grape mash into the fire. Did you say that? Mm-hmm. Why would anybody do that? That would put out the fire, and I don't think it's something people do. Is it possible that they might have fed it to the goats, and then they use the dung for fuel?
That's happening as well, but in some cases we have fire pits without any dung in it, so without as a fuel, and so they might have just had some. You know, you might have like back then, like today, you buy a bottle of wine and it's nice, right? It's clean and everything else. But back then, your wine probably, when you poured it into a glass, you had to sieve out the gunk. So some of those things are going to be the gunk that are the pips and the skin still attached to them. So because it's not like today, we don't have to drink it through cheesecloth or anything, but back then they would have had to sieve their wine when it was done.
One more observation.
Okay.
You showed a lady dealing with a lot of pots and indexing them all, I guess, and cataloging. What happens to those pots? Do they stay in Jordan, or are they exported to Notre Dame or some other place?
So those the tombs that had the pots that were sold are now all over the world. But the vast majority, we're talking thousands of pots. There were maybe 6,000 whole pots. Most of them are in Jordan, in the Department of Antiquities, in the museums and places like that. Some of them are in Pittsburgh. Some of them are at Harvard. They're all over the place. There's a bunch in Chicago. There's a seminary in Chicago that has a tomb group. Some in Philadelphia. But for the most part, the vast majority are in Jordan.
Any questions?
Other questions? Stan?
For a wonderful lecture and for new direction. The fact that you are in charge of the archive and more.
It's kind of terrifying, actually.
It's awesome. But one thing that I was thinking about your project. What about the coming of the internet and the exchange between these two colleagues after they start to use email?
Tom printed everything. Yes, we have, yep, Tom printed it all.
Because, you know, this is the challenge.
It is.
Back in the day with the old letters and all that, you really had access, but that's amazing. He actually did print out the
He printed them, yep. And what was interesting, because I don't have most of Walt's archives. I don't have that at all. But when Tom would send a note to Walt, he would carbon copy it for himself. So that's why we have all of his notes to Walt. And same with email. They would just print out these long email strings. So we have on little dot matrix printers, we have these long strips.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's amazing. There was a question in the back, I feel like. Yeah.
If I understood correctly, you said that a lot of people left around
2,500. Yeah, they walk with their feet. They voted with their feet.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the questions?
Okay. So you're asking about that time when everybody left.
Yeah. Do you know, is there any evidence as to what drove them off?
So the question is that when everybody voted with their feet at about 2,500, when everything just fell apart, why? What's the evidence? So we have some pretty good environmental evidence that the environment was changing. And what's likely is that they didn't make the right choices. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? So they're having trouble socially or economically or in whatever way, they aren't able to keep feeding those large groups. So a lot of people go out. What we do have are smaller villages after that time. Mostly what we have are tombs. We don't have a lot of sites. So that gives us the sense that they might have didn't even want to live in a village. They went out to live in farmsteads, to support smaller groups. So that the evidence is kind of negative. We do have good evidence on climate change. Things changed, and it looks like people didn't figure out solutions to this change to be able to maintain those communities. What they did, we have a few excavated villages. Some of them have walls around them in some parts of Jordan, but for the most part, it seems to empty out and become very, very dispersed. Yes?
You did mention that there were some houses that were outside of the walls. Do you know if there was a reason if they were social outcasts or, it's something that they've maybe been kicked out of the settlement? Is there any evidence as to why like the houses were there?
We have no idea. It's a great question. So the question is why do you have houses outside these walls? I don't know if it's a matter of space and scale. I can think of a lot of walled towns and walled cities in the world throughout history where people lived inside and outside at the same time. But we have no idea. We have no writing from this time period. We actually have almost no artwork from this time period, so we don't have a lot of human representation. So we got basically no way to answer your very good question. So I'm sorry about that. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you, in 2500, when the Exodus started, do you have any idea of the number of people that lived in the walled city, or in any of those time periods?
All right, I'm going to be completely honest and say no, but anthropologists have spent a lot of time in the last 50 years especially looking at villages today that are about the same size, and especially in the Middle East, there's been a lot of what's called ethno archaeology, where you do ethnography, you study the modern day people, but you do it with sort of like an archaeologist's eye. And there have been tons of people that will say, okay, each of these houses has this many feet or square meters, and then here's how many people living. So they do this little calculation game, but it's all just, I mean, there's lots of different, the variety of those numbers is huge.
So you don't know if it's 50 or 5,000?
I got nothing.
Okay.
But I'm not a numbers kind of person, so I don't play that game. But there are lots of people, that's their bread and butter, and they love doing that. That's just not me.
Would you address the problem of water?
Of water?
Water.
Okay. In terms of where they're getting their water from back then?
It looks to me like the resources are very limited.
Right now they are. I'll tell you that at those sites at about 11,000 years ago, it was wetlands. And so I have excavated at one of the earliest villages in the world called Dra, which is just up the street from Babadra. And we found tons of fauna, and it was all birds. It's all waterfowl. During this time period, you saw how all those sites are sort of up on hills. That down cutting is very recent. There's been more than 50 meters of erosion sinking those wadis to the bottom. So at that time, those rivers would have been sort of right next to those sites. And in fact, they're probably running irrigation channels off of those rivers. So I think at that time, water was not as much of a difficulty as it is today. Yes?
I think that ties into my question. I was going to ask about the so-called cedars of Lebanon, I guess, which were very voluminous at that time. Armadas of ships, I guess, were built from the cedars. And you see no trees in these pictures but yet they had wood to build their buildings.
They have beams. They definitely have beams. We have wood samples that have not been analyzed yet. That's another one of those little things that we need to do. If you remember in that one tomb I showed you, there was a long wooden staff. So we know that there are trees. We know that there are olive trees. We know that there are palm trees. There's all sorts of trees around. Part of those reconstructions are we don't know what kind, and so we haven't put them in. Because we try to keep very closely to the data that we do have. But that there are going to be trees, and we do have burnt beams that came down in a lot of those buildings that they were definitely using for their roofs. Yes, sir?
I recently read a book about Antarctica in which they do ice core borings.
Yep.
And try to correlate what's going on meteorologically with any particular age. And apparently these are able to be fairly precise. Have you attempted to correlate what you're doing with any of these emerging evidences from ice corings?
I haven't, but there's a woman named Arlene Rosen who studies pollen, and so she's doing pollen cores into the lakes there, but also correlating with the ice core evidence in terms of how much water is tied up in the glaciers and how much, so you're looking at water levels and things like that. And it gives you basic climatic information. And that's where our climate data is coming from. It's coming from, really from pollen cores, but also from the ice, sort of the broader ice cores, the oxygen isotopes. So I'm not doing it, but that's where that great environmental data is coming from. Yes?
You mentioned in the place where some of the bones were found that there was a staff left there. So is there some indication of an afterlife they're thinking of? And this is also, BC. So any indication that they're thinking that there's something after this?
No writing. I could say, like everybody, as an anthropologist, all cultures have different ideas about what you do with their dead and what it means to go afterwards. And so they might have thought about an afterlife, but they also might have thought that maybe you go around the wheel again. Maybe there's reincarnation, or maybe that you just stop, and that's part of what you're supposed to be doing. So I don't know. I can't say because we have no writing at all. But I do know that when you look at mortuary practice, when you look at what people do, funerary practices throughout the world, there's pretty much anything you could think of to do with a dead body gets done in a particular structured way. Whether you bury them, whether you cut them up and feed them to vultures, whether you do whatever, whether you leave them out to be exposed. Though there are important rules about how you treat your dead. But there's no easy guideline for what those rules are and then what people believe happens to people on that next stage. Does that make sense? So I just can't tell you yes or no. I have no idea.
So on that note, let's resume our speaker.
Thank you.